Super Bowl 56 pits two animal species, Bengals and Rams, but there's something else that's worth noting that indicates a positive sign for horses abused by racing. An update on horse racing, next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil, Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, horse racing season officially starts in February with the march toward the Kentucky Derby in May, often called the most exciting 2 minutes in sports, or maybe it's just the most abusive. There's still no official winner of the 2021 Kentucky Derby. Medina Spirit won, but was found to have been drugged, casting a cloud over his world-famous trainer, Bob Baffert. But then, just last December, the horse died. There's still no winner. The story is par for racing, which, despite a lack of integrity, still lures bettors wagering an estimated $12 billion in 2021. It's the highest since 2009. But there were just 33,567 races, a 32% decline in races when compared to 2009. Fewer horses, many of them too injured to run, interest also waning. To give you an example, horse racing draws $12 billion in 1 year of wagering. The Super Bowl is estimated to attract 31.4 million bettors, wagering $7.6 billion in one game. Interest in horse racing pales by comparison, which is why PETA has focused on raising the awareness of the abuses of the horses themselves. Here's an update from the leader of PETA's Equine Matters Department, Kathy Guillermo, on the PETA Podcast. Equine Matters, that's a real department within PETA, huh?
That's right. And we work primarily on horse racing issues. Sometimes a little bit of issues involving exploitation of horses in the Olympics or in other competitive areas.
And so, once again, the horse racing industry seems to be in the news, a bit of disarray. Some people say a great amount of disarray on multiple fronts. The horse racing industry can't seem to stop the scandals. Let's go through some of these. We have Bob Baffert and the Kentucky Derby. Where are we on this at this point?
Well, some people may remember that long ago in 2021, last May, almost a year ago, a horse called Medina Spirit, trained by Bob Baffert, won the Kentucky Derby. Or it seemed that he won the Derby. It was discovered later that he had the presence of a medication in his system, betamethasone, that is prohibited above a certain level on a race day in the state of Kentucky. This normally means that a horse will be disqualified from winning that race. In this case, Bob Baffert and his attorney made quite the big stink, claimed they had no idea how that medication got in the horse, or even if they believed it. They have the right to have the sample retested, which they did with great fanfare. It took many, many weeks. And the upshot of this is that almost a year after the Kentucky Derby, we don't know who won. Bob Baffert has not been held accountable. The Kentucky Horse Racing Commission, which is supposed to hold a hearing and decide what they're going to do about this violation, has not held a hearing and will not say when they're going to. And the only thing that I can say that is good that has come out of this is that Churchill Downs, the company that owns the track where the Kentucky Derby is run every year, has said that Bob Baffert is not welcome for 2 years. He will not be allowed to race at their track, and it's a privately owned track, so they can make this decision. And he will not be allowed to have horses trained by any of his associates running at their track. So that's the good that's come out of this so far. Other than that, what a mess.
Yeah, and Baffert is the big star of horse racing, and he's also, it appears from all these, maybe perhaps the most crooked?
Hard to say who's the most crooked in the world of horse racing. because as we've seen over the last year, 30 indictments handed down by a court in New York State for doping in the horse racing industry. And some of those cases are now going to trial. A veterinarian was just convicted for selling illegal substances to multiple, and I mean probably 100 or more clients in the racing world, and he may go to prison for a very long time.
All right, we're going to get to that, but let's finish off with Baffert. It's been more than a year, or almost a year. He went back to California. He took Medina Spirit with him, and then in December, Medina Spirit collapsed and died. Now, what happens now?
That's another very good question, and that's, of course, the tragedy in horse racing is always for the horses. I mean, we talk about these scandals, but the ones who pay the price are the horses in every case. And everybody, again, associated with Bob Baffert and his barn are claiming they have no idea how this could have happened. This is a young, supposedly healthy horse, goes out for a workout. At the end of the workout, falls over and dies. Immediately, people in racing started saying heart attack. Well, I mean, how do they know that? Nobody knows that. And I think some of our listeners may remember that from 2011 to 2013, 7 horses in Bob Baffert's barn, 7 horses he trained, died in a similar way. And it was never really figured out exactly why, although all of them were on thyroid medication, even though none of them had thyroid disease. So there was clearly something strange going on there. And now here we have the not quite winner of the Kentucky Derby is dead, and we'll be having the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission try to decide if a horse who is no longer alive actually won or didn't win the most famous race in America.
Wow. So did Medina Spirit die as, I guess he is sort of the winner now with an asterisk, or how did he die a champion, or did he die in disgrace? Or can you put any of that on the horse? It's really the trainer, right?
No, he died while being used and abused by an industry that has made itself most famous for killing horses. And that's really the tragic bottom line for this. And we don't know. I mean, Kentucky seems to be terrified of making a decision. California is not far behind because we are awaiting the results of the drug tests and the necropsy. That's like an autopsy for animals, of course. The necropsy results on Medina Spirit. It's been some weeks. We know that the laboratory at University of California at Davis has completed its review, and we're still waiting for the California Horse Racing Board to release those results. So we don't know yet why this horse died.
Now, despite all that, you'd think that it would discourage people from taking part in this sport, either as bettors or there'd be some kind of uproar from the industry. Is there uproar from the industry about, hey, this isn't right or doesn't look right? Or is there uproar from the bettors who are saying, hey, I bet on Medina Spirit and I've already spent the money from the winnings, or the horse that came in second should win? Or is there anyone out there who are forcing the industry to do a better job and come to a conclusion?
There is all kinds of uproar on all sides. Of course, you have PETA and the people who care about the horses saying, this is ridiculous. The industry is not able to police itself. It's doing a terrible job. It can't even keep the horses alive. You have the bettors saying, well, this was obviously a cheating game. I want my money back. And following PETA's example from an earlier lawsuit in which we helped a bettor sue an owner and a trainer for doping a horse, which affected the outcome of the race, and that bettor won, a group of bettors has filed a lawsuit against Bob Baffert for what they see as violating their rights as people who bet in what's supposed to be a clean game. Then we have the people in racing who are hoping things get cleaned up and want to see it improved. And they're embarrassed and ashamed by this star of the racing world, Bob Baffert. And then we have the group of people that thinks Bob Baffert can do no wrong. But I will tell you that what we also see is a shrinking industry. And we see fewer horses born in 2021 than any time in the last 40 or 50 years. And we see fewer races, fewer horses in races. So clearly it's having some kind of an effect.
So maybe the best approach is the more there's this kind of pressure, the industry is sort of like its own pimple that gets smaller and smaller, and then it just goes away.
As PETA has said all along, there cannot be even one death in horse racing for racing to be tolerated, not even one death. And I have always said racing is its own worst enemy, that every time they take one step forward in the right direction, somebody takes two steps backwards. So I think it's in a very precarious position now. The Washington Post has editorialized for ending horse racing. And there are, if you follow Twitter and look at the comments on there, people are falling away from it all the time and choosing to bet on in some of the other areas, the other sports, which are now legal for betting in many states.
I only mention this because it seems that before the state concludes anything on Baffert, they can see where the racing industry lacks a certain amount of integrity, if not transparency.
It's a joke to much of the world now. Horse racing in the United States is just kind of a joke. The star of the whole industry is in disgrace. Horses are dying at an incredible rate on tracks across the country.
Yeah. And speaking of California, Jeff Blea is the equine medical director of the California Horse Racing Board, had his veterinary license suspended. What is that issue about?
Well, this was a very interesting turn of events that occurred. Jeff Blea is a veterinarian, as you pointed out. He's the equine medical director for the California Horse Racing Board. That means he's in charge of making sure that all of these issues with medication and other issues surrounding the care of racehorses, that all the regulations are properly followed and that they're being enforced by the board. He's also a professor at University of California, Davis Veterinary School. He's been the head of the group of equine practitioners for the Veterinary Medical Association. He's a top figure in the veterinary world of horse racing. And the Veterinary Medical Board for the state of California released a complaint against him, saying that they had evidence that he had violated state veterinary code in a number of ways. And the most significant, in my opinion, among what was listed is that he allegedly prescribed different kinds of medication, including thyroid medication, to dozens of horses that he allegedly had never seen before, that he did not know, that he had not examined, and that he had not treated.
And what's the impact of giving thyroid medication? Is it something that is more than just therapeutic, but maybe a performance enhancement?
That's part of it, I believe. We uncovered the use of thyroid medication in our 2014 investigation that we released it in 2014. We conducted it in 2013, our investigation of top trainer Steve Asmussen in New York State. And we found that he, with the help of his veterinarian, was giving a medication for animals who have been diagnosed with hypothyroidism to all of his horses without a diagnosis of thyroid disease. And that, in fact, was something that he was fined $10,000 for after our investigation was released. And as I mentioned before, some of the horses who died, the 7 horses who died about a decade ago in Bob Baffert's barn, were all on this thyroid medication. It caused quite a big scandal during those years. And in 2020, the California Horse Racing Board enacted a rule stating that thyroid medication could only be given to horses who actually have thyroid disease. Otherwise, it's a violation. And there are quotes from Jeff Blea himself stating that if you see a handful of horses with hypothyroidism in your veterinary career, that's a lot. And yet, allegedly, he's prescribed this thyroid medication to dozens and dozens of horses. So this was an enormous scandal because he is such a high-profile veterinarian and because he's in an advisory position. The California Horse Racing Board immediately came out in defense of him before this case had been adjudicated, So the Veterinary Medical Board suspended his license because they didn't want him overseeing the investigation into Medina Spirit's death.
And so the significance is he might have covered up, or he might have done something to help the horse race industry, Baffert?
Well, I can't speak to exactly what the veterinary board was concerned about, but I think that if you are involved in a process whereby you're giving medication to horses who may not need it, or certainly to horses whom you have not even examined, that your motives are somewhat suspect. And I'm trying to say that as well as I can, understanding that this case has not been tried yet. The license suspension was a temporary move until they take this case to court and see where they land.
And now it's not just Blea, apparently, who's being investigated. There are others?
Vince Baker, a veterinarian who practices largely in California, has been accused of many of the same kinds of actions. And the interesting part here is that Vince Baker, one of his clients is Bob Baffert.
And it's the same drugs used, the same kind of MO?
It's the accusations are very similar. Prescribing medications to horses who have not been examined or diagnosed, or with whom he has a veterinary patient relationship.
So it's not, these investigations show that it's not just the trainer, it's not just the owner, it's not the jockey, it's the veterinarians as well who might be involved in this.
Well, we have always known that some veterinarians must be complicit because the medication comes from the veterinarians. So if, as we have shown over the years, horses are being over-medicated to keep them racing when they're not in good shape, when they should be resting, there has to be a veterinarian somewhere along the line who did that prescription. But this has really taken many people in California and the racing world by surprise, because these are two very high-profile veterinarians. So we have seen many in the racing world immediately leap to their defense. And I took a look at what the accusations are, the complaints that were filed. I can't say if they're true or not, but if they're true, I believe they're very serious. Many people in the racing media have stated that they're paperwork issues where things were not properly recorded. I don't think giving a medication that's a very serious, impactful medication to a horse who's not even been seen by the veterinarian is a paperwork issue.
Do you think these investigations have contributed to the fact that if you can't have medications like these given to horses without prescriptions, without being seen, then those horses aren't running? Hence, we're seeing fewer horses at races throughout the state in races.
Well, there are probably a few reasons for why we're seeing fewer races and fewer horses running. After the many horses in California died in 2019, the racetracks knew they had to do something, and they did take significant action to try to prevent horses who aren't in good shape from running. So many more horses have been what they call scratched or not allowed to race because they're just not in good shape. So we have seen that have its effect. There are probably other reasons for why the numbers have decreased, but I think on the whole, it's because racing is under great scrutiny right now, and people are not certain it's a field of work they want to go into.
So we're talking about California, but really there are investigations, or at least people looking into how the industry is running throughout the country, specifically New York. There was a piece that came out in the Albany Times-Union. What did the newspaper investigative report expose?
This was a really stunning article that came out that is done by an investigative reporter at the Times-Union who is looking at a variety of issues surrounding horse racing in the state of New York. And this was the first, this was the first of a series of articles that she did. But what she found is that the laboratory that is supposed to do all the blood sample and urine sample testing to test for the presence of illegal substances is underfunded and out of date and not doing nearly as many tests as it should. And so while other states have had dozens, sometimes more than 100 positive tests, when I say positive, I mean they have tested these samples and they have found that in dozens of cases, horses had substances in their system they weren't supposed to have on racing day. In the last 14 years in New York State, there have been almost no violations. And I laugh, not because it's funny. It really isn't funny, because we know people are drugging horses in New York State. That's where the 30 indictments for illegal doping came out of. I laugh because the irony that in a state where we know so much is going wrong, that they have not even been able to enforce the very few laws that they have to protect horses. So it was quite an indictment of the New York racing industry.
What is going to save it? What is going to reform? If you don't have the industry cooperating to the degree that they need to, how is it going to right itself? Who is going to either force them, or are they just going to run the industry into the ground?
Oh, I think that's exactly what will happen. And if they can't do any better than that, that's exactly what should happen. I don't think there's anybody who's going to come along and save racing in spite of the efforts of, at least in New York State, some legislators who want to prop it up at any cost. But racing is its own worst enemy, as I've said all along, and we're going to continue to hold it accountable for what its violations are. We're going to continue to expose when we find that something is wrong. We're not going to let up on that. And as we've started to do in New York State, we're also going to expose when residents of states are forced to subsidize an industry like this, they need to know about it. We've been working with a coalition of human services organizations, education organizations, worker justice organizations in New York State to expose the fact that money from video lottery terminals, which are like slot machines, are going to prop up racing in New York State to the tune of about $230 million a year. This is basically corporate welfare for an industry that should be supporting itself. And there are legislators now who've introduced a bill to get rid of this subsidy and to redirect those funds back to the state.
You know, a lot of this money is generated from gambling, and you would think that bettors would say, hey, there's better opportunity, better odds. No one gets hurt when they turn their attention to these other forms of gambling, like slots and those lottery terminals and casino gambling. And the biggest thing now that is really sweeping the nation, it's Super Bowl weekend coming up. Football betting, sports betting is now coming out of the shadows, being legitimized, and that has to have some kind of impact on horse racing. Is it helping it like say slot machines were subsidizing horse racing, or is it doing more to really shift people's attention more toward these other forms of gambling?
Well, there are no shortage of other betting opportunities for bettors now. And I think that we'll probably see people increasingly turn away from horse racing. It's a funny industry because we see that there has been an increase in what they call the betting handle in some states, which is the total amount of money that is bet on horse racing, even while nobody goes to the tracks. You can go to a track in New York State and there might be 10 people there on a weekend race day. We commissioned some polls in New York State and found that 89% of New Yorkers would like to see that subsidy money, that corporate welfare, be taken away from horse racing. And a second poll found that I believe it was 94% of New Yorkers said they had not been to a racetrack in the last year and they had no intention of going to one ever. So it's a bizarre little industry that manages to keep itself alive with money from various places, including their own online betting programs. but it should support itself in any case and not expect that those of us who care about what happens to horses and frankly, what happens to the workers on the backstretch should have to pay for.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at the racing industry and you see it going on in these really grand architectural structures, like when you look at Santa Anita, you look at Saratoga, you look at places like that, they were all built in a bygone day where there were used to be thousands of people in the stands, really appreciating the whole sport and betting and doing everything that you do at the races, right? The sport of kings. But now things have gone online. There's hardly anyone at the track. There aren't even horses to run races. It almost seems like we are on a downhill slide where maybe it's sooner than later that racing sees its demise.
Well, it's important, I think, to bring it back to what it means for the horses, because the horses, of course, aren't running machines. These are individual animals. They have their own personalities. These are herd animals. They like to be in groups of their own kind, and yet most of them are forced to live in a 12 by 12 foot stall, 23 hours a day. They get out only when they're training. Most of them no longer have access to any sort of pasture. I mean, in the early days of racing, there would be a few weeks of a racing circuit and then the horses would go back to the farm. That's not the case anymore. Some horses have lived at a single racetrack for the last 5 years. I was looking at one the other day. They don't have their needs met. And too often they're medicated to keep them running when they shouldn't be. It's just not a healthy situation for horses. And fortunately, in America, we have a population, and frankly, elsewhere in the world too, but certainly here in the United States, we have a public that no longer wants to support that kind of treatment of animals, and certainly not for entertainment purposes. So in spite of increased betting handles in some areas, racing is barely hanging on in many others, and it certainly will go if they don't clean themselves up a little bit.
Besides self-preservation of the industry, what is their best argument to keep it afloat? Just saying, hey, our livelihoods are at stake.
I mean, we've seen industries go by the wayside in the past, right along with that argument that we're employing people. I mean, thousands of children worked in factories in New York City for many, many years. And yes, when they ended child labor, it did mean that there was less money going to the families, but they did it anyway. And I doubt very much that the industry employs quite as many people as they say they do. We look at the claims made in New York State, for example, that they employ directly or indirectly 19,000 people. We had a financial firm take a look at their claims, and they stated clearly that there were many unanswered questions, such as, if there weren't racetracks, would those jobs even be lost? Because some of them were hotel jobs. So, the claim that we're keeping hotel workers employed with a track that nobody goes to is pretty suspect, one way or the other, whether they provide jobs or whether they don't. They're certainly providing a lot of misery for horses, and that's got to be the main concern.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior VP, on one of her areas of concern, the Equine Matters Department. For more, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at AMOK.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's at ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.